Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of IHL in Film. Today we'll be discussing Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer gives us the opportunity to discuss nuclear weapons. We'll be looking at US bombings during the Second World War of Japan. We'll be looking at a number of issues of IHL as they apply to nuclear weapons. And as always, I'm very happy to have with me Aisha Malik, who is our resident legal advisor on all things IHL. Aisha, how did you like the movie?
I really liked it. I was riveted the entire time. I thought it was incredibly well written. I thought it was really well shot. Sometimes the non-linear storytelling really doesn't work. And this time I thought that it challenged me the entire time to try and place everything, but in a really good way. And it was a long movie and I didn't feel it. And usually I really feel long movies. I really, for me, I really loved how the film opened with him looking at Cubist art, because I saw that and I was like, oh, that's actually what his victims looked like by the end. And I thought right? Like, I thought that's what he kept on alluding to in terms of, even they were talking about the ripples that they kept on showing was the chain effect of what could happen with a nuclear weapon, and the way they showed the flayed skin of his victims. But we never saw a single Japanese civilian in the entire movie. And I kept on waiting for that. I thought that there was going to be a montage. I thought that something was going to happen to show the effects of what he'd done. And you never ever see it. And people were complaining that you wanted a moralizing film. This is just purely from his perspective, and that's why it's good.
But you know, and I fully agree with you on this. I don't think you can have even a moralizing film without the fact that he also realized the devastation of the weapon that he created. Right? I think that is also something that's part and parcel of this. I would have thought that the reason you liked the movie was because the protagonist was a communist.
But not a card-carrying member.
Yes, of course. That was the issue. But I think it raises a lot of issues. Now, there's obviously, the movie it touches upon certain aspects of IHL, and there's that one particular scene. But before we get to that, the development of a weapon of this scale and nature. Do you think this is something that, within the bounds of IHL, would be something that we can develop like now? Now, for example, if there was a new technology that offered the same level of destructive power, do you think it would be permissible under the rules of IHL to develop something like that? Yeah,
it's really interesting, because even when we look at nuclear weapons in that context, it was strange watching the film, because it seems so rudimentary what they were doing and the way they were kind of putting it together. And yet you had all of these scientists come together. They all were in Los Alamos doing this.
Absolutely.
And kind of just in these study circles trying to think about, what should we do, the hydrogen bomb, should we do this? And I remember driving back from the cinema and thinking that I'm living in one of the poorest countries in the world, and we got this technology through being wily and sneaky. I'm very proud of us for also getting
absolutely.
that. But in the context of IHL, we've had a nuclear weapons advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which towed the line in that it did not decide anything at all. And it's been heavily criticized for not saying anything. They were like, well, yeah, generally it would be against the laws of war to use a nuclear weapon, but if the state's survival is at stake, it could be used, which doesn't mean anything. It kind of conflates the law on the use of force with international humanitarian law. So very confusing judgment. But within the arguments for the judgment, it was that, well, if you had, and they were looking really to the future, to the prospect of you having clean nuclear weapons, which don't emit radiation at some point. Could they be used, say, against an army in a desert, in underwater where you don't have any civilians around? So they were like, yes, in most cases, especially if you're using it around civilians, it would be contrary to IHL, especially distinction proportionality. But in some limited circumstances, it could be. Now we know that we've never come up with clean nuclear weapons. Actually,
it's impossible.
It's sci-fi.
It's like peaceful uses of nuclear weapons that they have in the non-proliferation treaty, which is simply not there. You can't have a peaceful use of that. You can't have a clean nuclear weapon. Radiation will always be an issue, and it's something that you're seeing on the civilian side as well. Nuclear waste, for example, nobody wants to have a nuclear waste repository with them. So it's a very serious issue when it comes to this. But I think some of the questions that we get to is, why was there a need to develop this weapon, right? could, and go back to that question, could with regards to the Germans, we do see that there were efforts by the Germans to develop nuclear weapons as well, and so it's understandable. But with regards to the Japanese, were the same concerns there? Were the Japanese pursuing a nuclear weapon, and then ultimately this was because the Germans had already declared that they've had surrendered by that time.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to see how it was still justified to use this weapon.
Yeah, and you can see Oppenheimer in the film, which is why I don't buy I don't really buy his character redemption arc where he's like, oh my God, what have I done? Because he was pushing for it to be used. There is that one scene where he was just like, yes, but we haven't forced the Japanese to surrender. We haven't done this. We might have to use it. And there doesn't seem in the movie to be any military necessity to use it. It doesn't seem like Japan was capable of doing anything more than really Pearl Harbor. Now we know that historians have said that the Second World War didn't end because you used the atomic bomb. It was mainly because Russia was becoming involved in the conflict and they couldn't fight the war on both sides. So in terms of military necessity, it doesn't seem like there was any need to use that weapon apart from to show military might.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And that brings us to, I think, that scene which was, I think, a pretty haunting scene, right? Where they discuss targeting.
Yes.
And one reason for not targeting a particular city, Kyoto, was because he had honeymooned there.
Yeah. It's like Kyoto has a lot of cultural sites, and also me and my wife honeymooned there, and it was lovely. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
Absolutely.
This is the basis upon which 300,000 people died in those two cities, and not any others. Like that's mad. Yeah.
No, and also just before that, they also mentioned that they discussed whether a military target is there, and it's categorically, they reject it because there's nothing that is big enough, right?
Yeah.
Because they understand the potential. Another thing, and sorry, this I'm scatterbrained here, but I really want to discuss. When they were developing the weapon, there was that initial fear that they could ignite the atmosphere and destroy the entire world.
Yeah.
Just imagine playing with that type of energy.
So it's interesting because now when we look at it with the benefit of history, we know exactly what happens. But the film really, to me, laid out the infinite possibilities that were there. If I was sat in those circles, I'd be like, what about this hydrogen thing? It sounds more interesting than an atomic bomb. And also that they really didn't know what could happen with it. They really... they call him the American Prometheus, and I looked up, I was like, what did Prometheus do? And he brought fire from the gods and gave it to humans. So, the idea, but...
And he was punished for that.
Oh, yes, he was. Wait, what was he punished with? The pecking?
Not exactly my Greek mythology. Either it was pecking or it was evisceration or it's something, or it's pushing that was Atlas pushing a stone up a hill and watching it fall down again. But it's one of those terrible punishments.
Yeah. And I think the funny thing for me was that I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Yeah.
I may have set off a chain reaction which could end the universe. I think that was the line that he said. But actually he didn't. It hasn't been used since then.
What has?
The atomic bomb.
Yeah, the atomic bomb hasn't been used.
You're right. So in a way, it kind of. It's that age-old thing about nuclear weapons, like, did they actually escalate conflict or de-escalate it? Because the potential for its use is so catastrophic that actually it stops conflicts from getting to that point.
No, absolutely. And I think also what that leads to is that when you're talking about nuclear weapons, you're not talking about the rules of the game as understood with regards to any other weapon, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to a point where you're actually where rational actors are considering using a nuclear weapon, I think the laws of war, IHL, are then a subordinate consideration, if a consideration at all. Because again, as the nuclear weapons opinion said, when the state is at, when the survival of the state is at risk, you're willing to do literally anything. Right? And being individually held accountable before the International Criminal Court is probably a secondary consideration in that moment, right? Then this also leads to nuclear doctrines that states have. Like, when would a state use a nuclear weapon? Right? What is the U.S. nuclear doctrine? India has repeatedly said that it has a no first use doctrine. We have never clarified our doctrine until recently, where General Kidwai has given a few hints at what would be. So understanding when nuclear weapons will be used, can be used, I think is also very much part of the legality and non-legality of it. Because we're not just talking about the use of force. We're also talking about the threat of use of force? And does having a certain doctrine mean that this is a threat of force, right? That if you do this, we are going to fire.
Right. Yeah. And it's quite a powerful arsenal that a state holds in terms of when it is willing to use nuclear weapons. Because Pakistan has always said our existential threat is going to come lower than India's. So that threshold is going to be met sooner. But also in terms of a regional hegemony, because the reason why there is so much pressure in Iran to not develop nuclear weapons, and yet everyone will shrug and turn their head at Israel clearly having nuclear weapons, is that because then there is that counterweight there.
Absolutely.
And so with India and Pakistan, it was kind of, if India had it, there was no way we couldn't have it. And I know that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto has been heavily criticized for saying that our people will eat grass, but we will get the bomb. Because ultimately, it would never be him eating grass. It would be the population. At the same time, I think that if you have a neighbor which you're hostile with, and you see this now with the Koreas, because South Korea does not have nuclear weapons, and yet North Korea is definitely trying to get them. And so South Korea even made a comment saying, we will give you aid, we will give you wheat, we will give you grain, if you demilitarize and if you stop the pursuit of these weapons. And Kim Jong-il's sister said, no one sells their safety for rice cakes. And I thought it was such a powerful statement, because actually from a state's perspective, what is more important?
No, absolutely. I think with the advent of nuclear weapons, or the introduction within South Asia, as a Pakistani, I think it's far more easy to understand the need for nuclear weapons in this diet that we have with India, right? In this relationship, there is simply no possibility. It is an existential issue for Pakistan. I think we would have lost Kashmir quite a while ago. We would have, whether even our existence as a state would have been, I think what nuclear weapons does, and what I think the events of, say, February 27th, or the Indian Balakot attacks, or Kargil, and those things prove, is that there is space for conventional warfare below that, but it's to a limited degree. It is not going to escalate beyond that. Of course, this is a very dangerous position to be in, because once things start escalating, they can escalate. But at the same time, I think Pakistan's national security has very much depended on nuclear weapons, and of course, there are a whole host of associated issues with that. Now, what the issue is, I mean, if you want to discuss, is tactical nuclear weapons, right? Which I think the IHL is completely different on that, because that is used more as a conventional weapon. So, tactical nuclear weapons for our listeners are basically smaller yield nuclear weapons that ultimately you can use on the battlefield. And again, you try to use this below the strategic nuclear threat level or strategic threshold of the opposing country. So say there is a huge incursion into your territory, right, by the enemy. You will fire your tactical nuke in your own territory to destroy them and prevent them from further gaining territory. So it's not on their territory, right? Now, would such a thing, again, this is, Pakistan has, stated that this is something, a policy that it will pursue, tactical nuclear weapons. And the reason it does so is to bridge the gap between the conventional, warfare capabilities. Pakistan doesn't have as large a military, doesn't have the type of air force or those types of things. And because of that, we need to create something that will create an equation between the two. And that's why tactical nukes. So if we were to be overrun, we have this option that's there. So that's something that's interesting. Now, the IHL that applies there, can you fire, again, looking at the nuclear weapons opinion, if it's just a military target and it's your own territory, would it be permitted?
That's really interesting. In terms of proportionality, there is still radiation being emitted, even with the tactical nuclear weapons. So that would have to be taken into account. And also, one of the things that came up in this advisory opinion was from 1995, 1997. And so it's been such a long time since then international law has developed. They mentioned the environment there, but probably not in as much detail as we would go here. So what if you had a tactical nuclear weapon, injuries to civilians in the form of radiation, but also would it cause widespread, long-lasting, severe damage to the environment? Even noting that Agent Orange use in Vietnam didn't, because it's decades long. But radiation emitted might last for decades. I mean, we were talking about this before as well in terms of the conventional bombing has actually been worse, caused more destruction than nuclear weapons. And at the same time, the notion of so we've had quite a candid chat about Pakistan and it should have nuclear weapons. And the thing that really gets me is when I was reading the telegrams sent by members of the ICRC who were there in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there's a book called The Last Train from Hiroshima. And they described they were like, people didn't look like people. They looked like ant-walking alligators, that they were eyeless, faceless, just like red holes in their mouths. And I read that, a civilian account of it. And I was immediately like, there's nothing on earth that can justify the use of these weapons. Yeah. And yet, at the same time, when you're thinking in terms of strategy, you can't always think, when you're thinking about a state's survival, and especially because the scenario that we painted is to use that against your own people, cause that damage to your own environment, to the radiation effects, because they had issues with cancer even today in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People come in with, because it destroyed their white blood cell, like they decomposed entirely.
Absolutely.
It is something that people in command, in charge of dropping these bombs, and that was why the scene in the movie with Truman was such an interesting one.
Absolutely, it was a decision being taken without any knowledge of what would actually happen.
Yes,
right. And now, even with hindsight, with the seeing what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so much time has elapsed that I think a commander making a decision on the ground, and usually it's not a commander. If it's nuclear weapons, it's going to be your top level leadership of the country, right? But you cannot conceptualize, or you cannot fully understand the level of devastation that you will be unleashing, because now nuclear weapons today are so much more potent than they were back, than the ones that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 20, 30, 50 times stronger.
Oh, okay.
So the largest nuclear bomb that's been detonated has been the Tsar bomba by the Soviets.
Okay.
And that was 50 kilotons or megatons or whatever they call it, and it was just, if you see the clip of it, it just boggles the mind how explosive that was. You had mentioned that the bombing in Japan was, apart from these atomic bombs, there was very severe bombing of the civilian areas. I want to discuss that a little bit, because we understand that the Americans, they had laid certain priorities. Right, so they had said that there were 6 critical strategic targets: steel, aircraft plants, electronics, merchant shipping, anti-friction bearings, which I don't know what they are, and urban industrial areas. Right?
Okay.
And then by 1944, they also said that we want to target the morale of the Japanese, and so we will go after suburban, areas where there are urban areas where civilians reside.
Oh,
right, and in this, it was at this time that you also had the bombings of Dresden. They had happened, which was again really a civilian target entirely. And in this entire thing, what you see is Tokyo being targeted.
Yeah.
Because it met all of those criteria. It was a major industrial hub, and it had very high population density. And so on March 9th, 1945, napalm was used. Right, this had just recently been invented, and they started using it. Instead of high explosive bombs, they filled up 300 planes with thousands, and each plane I think was carrying about 1,500 bombs filled with napalm, and they dropped it over Tokyo, certain quarters of Tokyo, and in that one night there were 100,000 people who were killed, and 1 million made homeless.
Oh God!
Right.
Okay.
So that was is equal to the atomic bomb that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right. So it's unbelievable how and this was done to many cities. Now, and the reason they started using napalm was Japanese cities were like tinder, right? They were, the housing was all made of wood, and so they could catch flames, and then it would just, keep on expanding throughout the city. So the rules of IHL, even in that situation, become very, very difficult to really gauge here.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the deliberate targeting of the civilian population, and especially when there's no clear military objective, because you cannot treat a bunch of military objectives as one. You have to target them separately. So and also, I think in the Second World War, it was carpet bombing of civilians as well. So the Geneva Conventions, they specifically outlawed those, and especially in Additional Protocol 1, you have the obligations of precaution, military necessity, proportionality, which mean that you wouldn't have such shocking and awful carnage. And especially because it seems like it was such a collective punishment of the Japanese and the Germans as well. And when we look at it, we're always imagining international law as if there is a hypothetical court which is judging all of this. Yeah. But the court, so long as it remains hypothetical, and so long as we saw victim justice afterwards with the Tokyo trials and the Nuremberg trials, they were never convicted for what they did. And it must have been very clear then to the people after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is something that has remained and endured in our psyche for this long, that was a travesty, that was horrific. So for the people then to see the Japanese and the Germans being tried and it didn't seem like there was this huge question. And I think it's because the Holocaust is meant to overshadow everything else that came from any of the parties. But yeah, how can you 300,000 people dead only from atomic bombs, never mind conventional bombing?
No, absolutely. I think it changed the shape of history. It's just that one of those moments where everything changes after that. Aisha, I think if there's nothing else to discuss, this was an interesting discussion. So for anyone who's interested in this, do watch Oppenheimer. There's another really, really good show, Chernobyl, which is on nuclear issues. So if you get a chance, watch that.
And please recommend movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Recommend movies, and we'd be really happy to discuss them as well. Thank you very much. Bye.